Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading from the One Year Bible, and we examine some questions that extend our learning from the sermon on Sunday. Today I'm joined by Alyssa, Bream, and Dylan Wilkin. We're looking at a passage from Ruth chapter 2, verses 5 through 12. So I'm just going to read verse 12. It says, "May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done."
Yeah, our Bible reading today included this famous story. The whole book is just a single story, and it's Ruth. And this person had some serious stress. I mean, husband dying, traveling to a foreign land. And since we're talking about managing stress this week, will you give us a quick description of kind of what stress she was under and her story?
Yeah, so Ruth, I say frequently, is one of my favorite stories in all the Bible. It is a perfect illustration of living under some incredible life stress. So she had stress of loss and grief. When you read chapter 1, verses 3 through 5, Ruth's husband dies, along with her father-in-law and her brother-in-law. So, they're widowed. They don't have any protection or provision, which was really important in that culture. She had the stress of being a foreigner. So verses 16 through 18, she decides to leave her homeland, Moab, her family, her culture. She follows Naomi, who is her mother-in-law, to Bethlehem. And in Bethlehem, the Jewish culture, Moabites were viewed with a lot of suspicion and hostility. And then she had the stress of just trying to survive. So she arrives with no money. Her mother-in-law is in debt, right? The family's in debt, which is one of the reasons why they've left. They have no money, no security. So she's gleaning fields, which is a humiliating and probably a dangerous task for a woman to do alone. And so she works from morning to evening in the fields. She's trying to gather enough food to survive each day. She's most likely exhausted. And as a foreign woman, she's exposed to a lot of harassment and abuse while she's working in the fields. And you add to that, she has this uncertain future because she has no husband, no inheritance, no clear path forward. And this is where we step into the story, right? She's gone into the fields of a man named Boaz, and Boaz recognized her trust in God, and he invites her to continue to glean in his field.
In the book of Ruth, it seems like we're watching God bring a person out of a very, very difficult situation, one step at a time. When Boaz first talks to her, he says, "May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you've done." I just feel like there's some deep meaning behind that statement. Alyssa, do you think you could shed some light on that?
Yeah, God's wings is an idea, is a symbol that is symbolism that's carried through a lot of scripture. So Moses uses it in Psalm 91. He says, "He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find a refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart." And that is the idea of like a mother bird sheltering its young, complete safety, warmth, security. And we also see God's wings talking about the covenant relationship that God has made with Israel in Exodus chapter 19. "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." And there it's this involvement with rescuing and leading his people, this majestic idea of, a large bird with these massive wings. The cool thing about wings of God here is that the idea shows up again later in Ruth in chapter 3, when Ruth uses the same language when she asks Boaz to spread his garment over her. And that word for garment there is probably also like a skirt, and it's kanaf. So if you think of what a skirt looks like, it kind of looks like wings. And it's the same word that Hebrew would use for wings. And this is a marriage proposal from Ruth. I don't think that she was actually expecting him to come and be like, woo, it was a marriage proposal. And she understood that God's protection and provision was able to come through Boaz. And we have this idea of a kinsman redeemer, that he is the one that God has, that set up through the law, but also through divine intervention to bring her and Naomi out of poverty.
I think Ruth's story reminds us that God is able to use the little events in our lives that seem coincidental to cause our situations to change. I think every situation doesn't turn around overnight. I know some I would like to. Ruth's story shows us how God uses people, time, and events to work out His will for our lives. What this teaches us about managing stress is the importance of trusting God to work in the details, in those small details. We do the right next thing and trust God. There's a great deal of freedom in that simple philosophy.
So have you ever, either of you, had God turn a situation around, like one little event at the time, and were you aware that God was in the arrangements while it was happening?
I think I definitely have. I definitely have. In terms of me knowing, hindsight is 20/20. So I had no idea in the moment. You can try and maybe reassure yourself, like, well, God's working in the details. But to be fair, in most of those situations in my life where things have been turning around one little thing at a time, it to me it has just seemed coincidental. And I just think about it like the people I talk to, just the daily things that happen. I didn't at the time think about it being, like I was following the will of God. It just seemed coincidental.
Yeah, I can think back to right after you leave college, I think is a very stressful time. That transition from like pretend adulthood. I don't know if I would call it that, but like where you're like, you have some freedom, but not a lot. And then you enter the real world and you're like, oh, nobody is going to have a cafeteria open for me to eat at. And one of the struggles that Tyler and I had as we had graduated, we got married, we'd been married for about a year, is that our plans for ministry just completely fell through. And there was like nothing we could do to fix that situation. So I can look back and see how God had lined things up for us to move into something different. But like the fact that like when I was in high school on a mission trip, that like not many people from my church were going on this statewide mission trip. And so like I went to this other church about an hour away, and that's where we ended up living. And we went back to that church and we had joined that church. We went to a random life group at that church. We're like, hey, they seem like they're probably going to have good food. They're our age. Let's go there. And at that life group, they had another friend that didn't attend the church but wanted to come to their life group. And so we're there and we got into conversations and more conversations. And then it was like, hey, I think we should start an art gallery together. There is no way that I could have known that each little step, but it felt like it was just the next right thing to do.
Right.
And that art gallery ended up being something that gave us purpose. We made $0 from it. In fact, we paid tithes to the church, the art gallery. But it was something that gave us purpose, and we learned so many things through that. We made so many great relationships. We did all of those things. And but it was one little step at a time. It was just taking the next right step. And so God is always in the next right step. And you can sometimes see that at moments. It was like, oh, wow, this is really cool that this guy who wants to start this and he needs some help. And we're like, yeah, we have a dog, but we don't have much else going on besides our, work. We can do this.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult in a step to see how it's going to work out. I think hindsight, you can see, okay, God was at work at this. Like, the Sunday I'm 6 months into attending church here, and the guy who's playing keys and leading worship, when he walks to me after service on Sunday and says, hey, I heard you played the drums. Would you like to play next week? My mind was that one day I'm going to pastor this church and we're going to have multiple campuses, right? Mm-hmm. That wasn't even there. But that it was a step, right? It was a step that if I didn't take, right, that the whole scheme of things looks a lot different. And I think that we can't minimize how one single step matters, and just being obedient, right? The thing we don't know, we see it, but we don't know why she ends up in Boaz's field. Um, I don't think anything is random. What was her process? What were the things that made her go there? Did God speak to her? Was it close by? What kind of things? Because I think God arranges those things for them to happen. And I think some of it is her character, some of it is Boaz's character. We see both of those people who seem to be used by God, willing to be used by him, and God's able to accomplish that. So how does the principle of doing the next right thing while trusting God help you manage stress?
I think it makes all the difference. When life feels overwhelming, I think it's easy to get stuck in the what ifs, or to feel pressure to have everything figured out. But I think we can take peace and have hope in knowing that doing the next right thing is just trusting God, following in the will of God, and paying attention to what He has for you. I think we can avoid a lot of stress that way, just like we talked about on yesterday's. Just being willing to follow in the will of God can alleviate a lot of that stress.
Yeah, when you're focusing on the present, which Scripture says, do not worry about tomorrow, it helps you have a manageable amount of stress. It's not that you're going to have zero stress. Right. In fact, as I was preparing for this podcast, one of the podcasts that I listened to had like a stress podcast. So I was like, oh, I'll listen to this. And then
it stressed you out.
No, it was all about how stress is good and we need stress in our life. And like, obviously it's not talking about like Easter week at a church stress. It's talking of, it was more of a medical scientific take on it than I was expecting.
Right.
But I think that it did make me kind of reframe stress in that, like, you need a manageable amount of stress. The manageable amount of stress is the next right step. And living in that moment and being fully present in the moment. And if you get overwhelmed, like taking a look around, being like, what are 5 things I don't know. There's a thing I've heard. What are like 5 things you see, 3 things you hear. I don't know. Sure. Like there's a thing like that where like being in that present moment, like can be like, okay, the past is the past. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. What am I doing right now? Right. And I think that is a biblical concept that is helpful.
Yeah, I think that next right thing is the key to being obedient. And being obedient eventually reduces stress. I think some of it comes with age. That's just my experience, because we are 3 consecutive generations here, right?
Close, yeah.
You're a Gen Z. You're a millennial. You're an older millennial, right? Is that how does?
I think I'm more in the middle-ish, older middle.
I'm an Xer.
An oldie.
But when I was young, I wanted everything now, right? I wanted I wanted it all now. And I still have some of that tendency, just because that's my nature. All right, let's just bite the whole thing at one time and go after it. But I have figured out that I can't stress myself, okay, if I'm not to X, at this point. For me, like at my age, I'm in that phase of, okay, what do I need to accomplish before I wind down? And so for me, the stress is making sure I do the right things, because when I was 21, is that what you are? When I was 21, I could have wrecked everything and started over again. And by the time I'm 40, nobody remembers, right? But if I wreck everything at my age today, right, that's what I end with. It's not, I don't have the time to recover. And so doing that next right thing, and I do think narrowing it down, and saying, okay, I don't have to be out of debt today, or I don't have to be, build the house today or the church today or whatever, but what is the next right thing on that step for me to do? And it does lower the bar a little bit, helps us be able to manage it.
Right.
So. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around our daily Bible reading from the One Year Bible.